Hello, Hidden Gems. John and I are doing this pre-recorded tonight. Pre-recorded for good reason. Uh, by the time you're seeing this, I'll be on my way to Boise or in Boise, Idaho, awaiting the Lori Vallow Daybell trial that begins on Monday. And so, because I'm leaving tomorrow, Dr. John and I decided to pre-record for a special premiere this Beyond the Veil episode. And but I'll be here on chat. I'll be in Boise and on chat with you tomorrow night or tonight. Tonight's Saturday. So hello everyone. Say hello, John. John will
Hello.
be John will be here
Hello.
on chat too. And thank
Yep.
you for being here because we have a lot to cover in part 2 of Lori Vallow and her secrets. So thank you for joining us, and please follow along with us for the Lori Vallow Daybell trial. Let's hope that we get in. I know a lot of people are wanting to get in, and of course, most importantly, let's hope Larry and Kay Woodcock are able to be a part of this trial and in the courtroom as they had hoped for and have been hoping for 3 years. So, yeah. So, Dr. John, where? Oh, let me also say this. Many people are asking about my brother, Jamie, and there isn't too much to report. He is safe in the United States in a Miami hospital. He's in critical condition still, and he is in a coma still. And they have him sedated, so there isn't really much we can assess about his brain injury until he is no longer sedated. And much of my family is there. Although I can't be there, many of my siblings and my dad is there. And we just want to thank you for the prayers and the support. It's a waiting game right now and a difficult one. We love this baby brother of mine. So he is the glue of the family. So thank you everyone for your support and your comments. They've meant a lot, and that is the latest. All right. I think we're ready to go.
Okay, let's begin with our typical disclaimer. I want to make it known that this is speculation. These are my opinions. This podcast and this video are intended for educational purposes. They are not official court proceedings or they don't have anything to do with official court proceedings. So this is purely speculation. I want to point out that both Chad and Lori are innocent until proven guilty. They still await trial, obviously, which is going to begin shortly for Lori at least. And so I just want to make that clear.
Thank you. Your lighting looks so nice, by the way. We never record during daylight hours.
Right. Yeah, I'm more of a night owl, so I prefer to lurk in the shadows rather than to be in broad daylight. But yeah, here we are. Even a lot of my evaluations, by the way, I go down to Clark County Detention Center at night. So oftentimes when I'm doing evaluations, I will be there from 7 until 10 or 11 at night. So
yeah, nothing like visiting the jail at night.
So. Nothing like down the middle of downtown Las Vegas, just off of not far, a couple blocks from Fremont Street at 10, 11 o'clock at night, sometimes later than that.
Yeah.
But it is the detention center. There's a fair amount of presence of law enforcement. So there is that.
Thank goodness. Well, where would you like to begin? We have a lot of videos again, all those videos, including that insider info. We said we would share. I mean, we have a lot of insider info. What I mean is a story that nobody's heard before. We're going to share. We have all of our videos ready. Where would you like to start?
Let's just do a quick summary of what we talked about previously for those who weren't able to catch it or see it. And so I want to start with, I talked about juries and how they evaluate evidence. And I mentioned a book called Anchored Narratives, The Psychology of Criminal Evidence. It's by Willem Wagenaar. He's a Dutch psychologist, now deceased, but I mentioned that I thought this book is outstanding, and it's well out of print by now, which is amazing to me because I think every lawyer should read this, or at least every lawyer that's in the courtroom, because it really does provide, I think, the best depiction of how juries and human beings interpret evidence. And just to summarize their argument, or his argument, he argues essentially that juries interpret evidence based on stories and narratives. So juries will look at the most compelling, coherent, and plausible story that is told by either the defense and the prosecution, and then they will look and evaluate how well the evidence fits that storyline. So when he says anchored narratives, he's talking about a story that's anchored. An anchor is a reference point, but a story that's anchored by evidence. And so, like, I think of the Murdoch trial, where Paul's video was such an anchor. Paul's video was so critical, and the defense and the prosecution both had different storylines for interpreting it. And so it took the jury essentially less than 2 hours to deliberate. They obviously thought the prosecution's storyline was more compelling, which was that Alec was there when Paul recorded the video. There was no vigilante. And so the prosecution did an excellent job of really framing the story on that video, and then providing a compelling narrative as to why and how Alec, based on that evidence, would have committed these murders. So I think it's really important to point out then that what Wagenaar argues is that juries are not these rational creatures who sit in the jury box. They're actually quite emotional, and they're swayed more by narratives and storylines than they are by facts. Facts matter, but facts within the context of narratives. And I think so. I think when we're looking at a trial like Daybell, it's really important to understand. Last time I called them the main arguments, but I could also say the main storylines or the main narratives, how the defense is using them, how the prosecution's using them, how the evidence being presented is trying to anchor those particular storylines. So that's going to be really important. It'll be interesting to see what evidence, what calls, what videos, what texts, what each side uses to really tell the better story. Or at least in the case of the defense, a lot of times the defense just has to tell a competitive story that introduces sufficient reasonable doubt to cast into question the story that the prosecution is presenting. So when I think of like the Melanie Gibb call, for example, I think that's probably going to be something that the prosecution will try to use as a reference point and to try to use as an anchor for their story to show that both Chad and Lori knew that the children were missing. Mm-hmm. And that because one of the issues here, I think, in this trial is going to be who knew what. And if
absolutely,
if Chad is going to argue in his trial that he doesn't know that Lori is attempting to harm people, then he's not culpable. And if Lori argues the same, last time we talked about the idea of Breaking Bad, if Lori, for example, argues that, or her attorneys argue that she basically meets Chad, she breaks bad, she becomes this entirely different person, and that somehow Chad is making these violent decisions behind her back, or maybe he's communicating with Alex Cox, who he sees as one of his disciples to carry out his mission, and Lori doesn't know, then that's important. So the Melanie Gibb call would be an anchor of sorts, I think, because it shows that Chad and Lori are both communicating about what's occurring, and they seemingly both know that the children are missing and why the children are missing. And so, that's an important piece of evidence.
Yes, it is.
So I introduced that idea, and then I talked about how, given that, and given the fact that people are going to see various arguments here and various storylines about what's happening, I basically said that, and I'm going to shorten this from last time, but I basically said that Chad Daybell drives the entire drama here, the entire narrative, because his system of light and dark and his idea of zombies is what in the end leads to the murders.
Right.
Everybody in this story that's labeled or identified as a zombie ends up dead. And so in that
It's
sense, I'm sorry.
oh, I was gonna say it's Chad's belief system.
Yeah, Chad's belief system, right? Exactly. So in that sense, I compare it a little bit to an analogy would be Matthew Coleman, who, for those of you who don't know, we've talked about Matthew Coleman on our Patreon, but Matthew Coleman,
Also here, some here too.
yeah, a little bit here. Matthew Coleman murdered his two young children. It's such a heartbreaking tragedy. I mean, so is this one. They all are, but Matthew Coleman is a surfer who believes that he did believe, I don't know if he still does, I think he may have changed a little bit in prison, but he believes that there are alien human hybrids out there who have reptilian or lizard DNA combined with human DNA, and eventually these lizard people are going to destroy the world. This is a narrative, by the way, developed by a British guy named Icky. His last name's Icky. David Icky. I
David
think
Icke.
I'm pronouncing that right.
No, yeah, you are.
He's been telling this story for like 20 years. This narrative, this story about lizards has been adopted widely by QAnon followers. And so Matthew Coleman, who was also a big QAnon person, he took his kids to Mexico and he brutally murdered both of them. It was just horrendous. One of his children was actually alive for quite a while, and then he continually had to take further actions to murder his child. And it's anyway, he did this because his belief was that his children would eventually threaten the world and create some harm. And so he had to rid the world of this horrible risk that his children posed, and he murdered them. So again, like Chad Daybell, it's, as you point out, it's the belief. It's the belief system here that's driving this whole process. With Matthew Coleman, it's the belief in not zombies, but these alien human hybrids. And with Chad Daybell, it's the belief that zombies are going to eventually take over the world. He has to rid the world of zombies before the apocalypse. And that really is his mission, and that's Lori's mission. And I think that, by the way, is why Lori, no matter what people say here, that Lori has some culpability because she knows about the zombie narrative and she participates in assisting Chad with whatever harmful actions he's proposing.
Correct. Right. Thank you. Side note, this is totally random before you keep going, but I've got to let our audience know because we get comments all the time. And now you can see when I'm looking at John, I'm actually not looking at John, I'm looking at a camera. And when I'm looking down like this, I'm looking at my handsome husband. So we get comments all the time about me that I shouldn't look at chat and I should only look at John. I'm actually looking at John and there is no chat because we're pre-recording this. So for those that want to know what I'm looking at, John, I'm looking at John, I'm looking at a camera. John, camera. Okay,
Right.
go ahead.
It's much easier to look at the camera when we're not live and fielding comments and questions. So my final thought that I introduced last week, we talked a little also about Alex Cox and how Alex Cox is probably going to be an easy fall guy or an easy target.
Correct. Absolutely.
For I would imagine for all of the defense attorneys here, because he's dead and because he seemingly played a large role in some of these murders. We don't know exactly what that role is. There's been a lot of speculation that he's the one who actually committed the murders. And so it would seem like Alex Cox could fill in a lot of gaps. If there's unanswered questions or uncertainties around certain evidence that I wouldn't be surprised to see Alex Cox fill those gaps. And at least for the defense, and in terms of trying to create a narrative where Alex Cox played a very large role and may have acted by himself, sort of a lone wolf type of situation that we talked about last week. And it seems like the defense would probably be inclined to do that, given the opportunity.
both Chad and Lori's trials will very much, I think, be about who did it, who's to blame, pointing fingers. And you're absolutely right. Alex is going to be somewhat of I think, a fall guy in both trials. You're right. Or an attempt to put a lot of blame on him.
Right, exactly. So that brings us up to date. I think that I introduced the idea that I was interested in this storyline or this argument that perhaps Lori broke bad, meaning that she meets Chad, she becomes a different person. This is very much a storyline that has been developed by several key players in this narrative, specifically the Cox family and to some degree April Raymond as well. So
Lori's friend, April.
April, right. April has been quite vocal about the fact that she believed that Lori was extremely different after she met Chad. So
a lot of people have been, though, about vocal like
right.
that. Yeah. Tylee's good friend and her mother, Echo, have talked about Lori being a great mother, and a lot of people seeing changes in her. Yeah.
But. So then we brought in Walter White from the show Breaking Bad and talked about how Walter White broke bad, and he broke bad because he had cancer. He was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He thought he didn't have long to live. So he started cooking meth and selling it, and he became a drug lord in short. And the question I posed was, is Lori like that? Is that the role that Chad plays in this story? And is that something that maybe the defense could sell to a jury in terms of an anchored narrative? Could they convince a jury that Lori's a lot like Walter White, but Walter White's crisis is lung cancer, Lori's crisis is the coming apocalypse. And Lori, I believe, is quite convinced of the apocalypse. I think she feels compelled to act because she believes the end of the world was coming on July 20th of 2020.
Yes.
We believe that those numbers, by the way, have some ties to the book of Revelation, but we won't get into that at the moment. That's pure speculation. Maybe we'll get into that later. But so how the question then becomes, if Lori breaks bad, so again, the storyline here is she meets Chad, she becomes a completely different person. She gets caught up in this drama of portals and zombies and dark and white ratings, light and dark ratings, and she really isn't making many decisions. Chad's making all the decisions. Chad's running the show, but she participates. She knows about it. She has influence on Chad, and so that's her role. But perhaps her influence is little. So this would be the argument for Breaking Bad. And let's evaluate this. So I think maybe the best way to think about this narrative about whether the story about whether Lori broke bad is to consider the idea of risk. Mm-hmm. And so let me start with Walter White. So,
and I want to say something about Walter White. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but many of our viewers from last week's video realized that his Breaking Bad moment, Walter White's Breaking Bad moment that we showed, that somehow it didn't get included. I want to explain that. We did show that video. John and I knew it was going to be a bit of a risk as far as perhaps would be demonetized because we used a copyright, but it was worth it to us because we wanted to show this definition between the before Walter White and the after Walter White. Well, we woke up the next morning learning that many of our overseas, not many, all of our overseas listeners could not watch our video because not only did they demonetize us, they blocked it from anyone overseas looking at the video. So that video was taken down, but I'm sure you could find it several places. It's a famous scene. We learned that the hard way, which is why they blocked it from being viewed by anyone. So we had to edit the video and take it down. But Walter White simply says, say my name, recognize me, say my name. You know who I am. I'm a drug lord. You know who I am. But I just want to give that explanation because many people didn't understand what was going on with us discussing a video and then coming back saying that's that was a good video. So that's what
Right,
happened
yeah.
in part 1.
So the summary is, just a quick summary of that. So Walter White in the first episode is mocked by some of his students. He's working at a car wash to make extra money. A couple of his students see him there washing their car. They take pictures, they laugh at him, they mock him. His brother-in-law, Hank, hands him a gun. Hank mocks him for looking like he's scared of his own shadow when he's handling the gun. So he's presented as kind of this meek guy who teaches high school chemistry, who's afraid of his own shadow. And then later in the series, as Lauren points out, there's this now I think fairly famous moment in television where he's meeting with members of the drug cartel, and he asks one of the members to say his name, and the guy hesitates because he knows it's a power play. So the guy won't say it, but Walter persists, and he finally says, "You're Heisenberg," and he says, "You're damn right I am." And he says it in such an assertive manner that you recognize now that Walter White is no longer this lovable loser high school chemistry teacher. He is truly a drug lord. He's transformed completely. So
Right. He broke bad. He
he
broke
broke
bad.
bad, right? So the question I would raise here is, and if we're going to evaluate whether someone broke bad, I think it's important to assess risk. In other words, what would Walter White's risk for violence be before he gets cancer, and what's his risk when he becomes a drug lord? And I think the same thing. I would ask the same thing of Lori. What's Lori's risks for violence prior to meeting Chad Daybell?
So
And
when you say risks, what are their risks for violence? Because that's what you do in your career is you
right,
assess for risk. You
I
assess
assess I assess for risks of recidivism. I mean, I've also done clinical work, a lot of clinical work with felons and offenders of all kinds, but my primary job for the last decade has been to do psychological evaluations and risk assessments for felons. And so I think answering this question of risk is really important. So if we think about Walter White, if Walter White doesn't get cancer and he remains a chemistry teacher, and I went in and did a risk assessment on Walter White for his future risks of violence, I would have to say that they would be next to nothing. So he would be very low risk. He would probably continue teaching chemistry until he retires. He would receive some type of pension, right? He would live
right.
out his life without much conflict, and so that would be Walter White. So I think Walter White clearly might be an extreme case. And by the way, the name White I think is completely relevant here. White as in bland, as in boring, as someone who doesn't take risks, right?
As
So
in good, light, and dark, if we're gonna go to Chad's
right, well,
scaling.
yeah, right, as in light, as right, exactly. And so towards the end of Breaking Bad, Walter White is wearing the black hat. The black hat, for those who know Westworld and know the Man in Black, played by Ed Harris, when a character in a show like Breaking Bad is wearing a black hat, that's a pretty good sign that things are not going well and that this character has now become he's gone to the dark side. He or she has gone
Something
to the
else.
dark side.
Yeah.
So we see that in Westworld. The character there in the initial episodes, the character there, Ed Harris's character, called the Man in Black, he wears white early on, and then he's dressed all in black towards the end. Same thing with Walter White. So thanks for pointing that out. But the main point is that it would be very, very hard to assess someone like Walter White as having any risks or, minimal risks for violence before cancer. And so cancer becomes an absolutely transformative event.
Hmm.
When
Right.
he's a drug lord, clearly his risks for violence are excessive. He's he
To say the least, yeah.
everybody who comes in his path that has to do with drugs in the drug world is pretty much ending up deceased. So obviously the before and after there is pretty extreme. In the case of Lori, I think this is where we want to go today. I think we want to take a little bit of a
Okay.
deep dive and try to understand Lori a little better and try to assess what her risk for violence would have been before she meets Chad Daybell. So why don't we start with, there's a fairly well-known recording of Lori that I think by now that I'd like you
Yep.
to play.
Yeah, to preface this, this is Lori Vallow Daybell, but she was Lori Vallow here, married to Charles at the time in 2018 at Melanie Gibbs' house, where she is sharing her testimony of Christ. She's with Christ. She's with like-minded, faithful members of the LDS church, but they all sort of have these additional beliefs. And she's sharing her testimony. This was originally played on Annie Cushing's channel Analytics. So let me play this moment of. Hold on.
Have a murderous heart. I just wanted to stop the bleeding.
I'm going to start that over because it missed the beginning. And I think it's
Okay.
important.
Yeah.
Oh, will you also mute, babe?
Oh,
Because I don't know if,
I did not have a murderous heart. I just wanted to stop the bleeding and stop the pain. And so someone wise was speaking to me and said, you need to go to the temple. So I went and met my bishop, and I was like, I'm either going to turn my life to the temple or I'm going to commit murder. So do you want to give me a temple recommend? And I was perfectly honest, because at that point I had nothing to lose. You get to the bottom rung and I had nothing to lose. And he gave me my temple recommend. And I started going to the temple every week.
let's see. I did not have a murderous heart. Make sure to unmute.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah. So this has become a fairly well-known piece that's made the rounds in the Daybell case for good reason. And the good reason is that it says a lot about Lori. People might say, after she says, the most important part of this, I think, to me, is Lori saying, I was either going to commit murder or I was going to go to the temple every day. And then you hear some nervous laughter. So, you might be able to interpret this as being a little sarcastic, or, she might be trying to be a little playful here. And I think the laughter might suggest that a little bit, but the fact that the outcome is that she starts going to the temple every day suggests that she's being completely serious. So
Right. She did go to the temple every day. We know
right,
this.
she did. And so the interesting part about this is that this shows us in a way how Lori Daybell thinks. This is how she processes the world, how she makes sense of the world, and that would be especially under stress. So
And let me emphasize something. You said this is how Lori Daybell thinks even before she was Lori Daybell. This is how Lori Vallow thought
Lori Vallow,
and processed. Right. Because if we're focusing on the whether or not she broke bad, this is Lori Vallow at this moment. Before
this is Lori,
before
right? This is Lori pre-Chad.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
And that's really important. So that it's pre-Chad. So everything we want to look at is right in analyzing whether she broke bad is pre-Chad. So she's introducing us or letting us have a glimpse of her thought process. And her thought process here is especially under stress, because she's talking about some of the conflicts in her marriage with Joe Ryan and how that created a lot of pain and she didn't really know how to deal with it. And right. So the interesting part of this thought process is it's binary. She sees the necessity of an either or choice here. She sees either the temple or murder. She doesn't see any other options. So this is someone who I think really oversimplifies the world. Somebody who really reduces the world to its most basic constituent elements and creates this binary decision, either or decision, which I think for most of us, that if we're experiencing relationship conflicts, no matter how bad it is and no matter how stressed out we are, we're probably going to see other options besides murder or a religious immersion. And so, but that's not how Lori sees the world. So I think this really gives us an incredible glimpse into Lori's decision-making process, in the sense that it's either for Lori religion or something on the complete opposite end of a religion, which is murder. So there's no in between for Lori. There's no compromise. There's no negotiation. Right. And I think that type of thought process is going to, by the way, so that type of thought process is going to increase someone's risk for violence.
Okay.
Because they're not
Yes.
able to deal with
Makes
nuance.
sense.
They're not able to deal with nuance, and they're not able to deal with complexity. In fact, I'm going to read a quote here from, this is a book called Humanizing Evil. It's an edited collection by Ronald Nasso and John Mills. There is an essay in here. So there's not a lot of work on why people break bad, by the way, in the field of forensic psychology. But this is an article on that. It's called Breaking Bad and the Rhetoric of Evil. It's by Ronald Nasso. This is probably one of the absolute best psychological analyses on the psychology of breaking bad. So here's what he says. This is page 97. Again, this is his essay, Breaking Bad and the Rhetoric of Evil. He says, quote, unable to entertain complexity and or empathize with views other than their own, these individuals are threatened by difference, inflexible in processing information contrary to their perspective, and capable of selective and non-veridical interpretations of reality. So in other words, what he's saying, and so his argument here is this is one of the reasons people break bad, is because they can't process complexity, they're threatened by difference, they're inflexible, and he calls it non-veridical interpretations of real, meaning that these people are extremely selective in terms of the evidence they use to process the world. So I think there's an argument to be made here that Lori's thinking, her thought processes prior to Chad Daybell have already moved her in the direction of Breaking Bad to some degree, because this is how she sees the world. This is how she sees negotiating issues with Joe Ryan. Right. And so here we have a little bit of a clue to why Lori Vallow Daybell can get to the point later where murder becomes an option. And we have a clue before Chad Daybell.
Before, keyword.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's so much to unpack in this statement, by the way. So that's my first part. The second part is that I think oftentimes people that resort to this sort of simplicity and this oversimplifying of the world, they tend to also struggle with a strong sense of themselves. In other words, I think that oftentimes they have what I would call an empty self. So actually the term I use is self by proxy. So what I mean by that is that if the self is relatively empty, then eventually something's going to fill in those gaps. Something's going to fill in that vacancy. And in cases like this, I think you have Lori is sort of, again, she's showing us who she is in the sense that it's either religion or murder. So she's kind of telling us that herself is those gaps get filled in by religion. So in the absence of a really sort of complex, strong self, an authentic self, you get this empty false self that gets defined by ideology or religion, or oftentimes these grand ideas, these abstractions that become a proxy for the self. So
Okay.
the self hasn't really, these people really define themselves very well, and so they're more susceptible to ideologies, or they're more susceptible to large abstractions that then become a proxy for a real self.
Hmm.
So I think you're seeing that here to some degree, and you see it a lot in these types of situations too, by the way. And
And the lacking of self, explain that. We talk about that a lot, like a lack of identity, knowing who they are. That's hard for some people to kind of understand what that means if we all know who we are. Um, Sorry, is that okay? A lack of self meaning, well, yeah. What do you mean by a lack of?
well,
I don't even know.
yeah, well, that's good. That's because that let's back up and talk about how someone could get to the point where their self is empty. And
Okay.
that's going to get us into a discussion of something we've talked about in our podcast previously, which is the idea of narcissistic families. So the book I've referred to in the past quite a bit is by Pressman and Pressman. It's called The Narcissistic Family. This book was written a while ago. It was written in, I believe, 1993. Let me just double check. It's been a while since 1994. So let me read how they define a narcissistic family, and this will get us to the idea we're trying to talk about about a false self or an empty self. So here's what Pressman and Pressman say about narcissistic families. This is on page 18. Quote, the narcissistic family often resembles the proverbial shiny red apple with a worm inside. It looks great until you bite into it and discover the worm. The rest of the apple may be just fine, but you've lost your appetite. In the narcissistic family, most of what happens can be just fine, but the emotional underpinnings are not there. The children are not getting their emotional needs met because the parents are not focused on meeting them. Instead of providing a supportive, nurturing, reality-based mirror for their children, narcissistic parents present a mirror that reflects their own needs. They expect their children to react to those needs. The focus is skewed, and the children grow up feeling defective, wrong, and to blame. When one is raised unable to trust in the stability, safety, and equity of one's world, one is raised to trust one's own feelings, perceptions, and worth. When one is raised as a reactive, reflective being, as in Echo, so Echo in the story of Narcissus and Echo, one has not been taught the skills necessary to live a satisfying life. So, in short, a narcissistic family is a family where oftentimes one of the major two caregivers, either the mother or the father, tends to be narcissistic. They don't even necessarily have to have a diagnosis of narcissism, but they tend to be so self-absorbed that they can't mirror or provide for their children's needs, emotional needs in particular, but other needs often as well. So the children become a reflection of the parents rather than the parents helping the children to figure out who they are, to develop a true self, an authentic self. So in other words, because the parents' needs are paramount and come first, the child then reflects those needs back to the parent rather than the parent reflecting certain of the child's emotions back to the child, or certain needs of the child back to the child. And by doing that, a parent who is more a mirror for the child, if the child feels sad and the parent says, you look sad, the parent is then giving that child the opportunity to figure out what they feel. And the parent is giving that child an opportunity to figure out who they are. That's how you develop what Winnicott would call an authentic or true self. And so,
Okay.
so the narcissistic family, this issue of narcissistic families is really critical here, because I think what happens in these types of families, and we'll talk about the Cox family in a minute, but what happens in these families is that the children really become mirrors of their parents, or they reflect their parents' needs rather than themselves. They haven't had a chance to really figure out who they are. And so here you end up with an empty self, or a self by proxy.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
in the Cox family, we know that religion was an extremely important element. And so given the beliefs in the Cox family and the importance of religion, and given perhaps some narcissism among some of the family members, it probably would have been a real struggle for these kids to really figure out who they were and what they wanted and what they valued. So Lori, I think, has some version of the self-proxy idea, in that she takes on religion to become who she is. That religion, in other words, is herself, and her views and her approach to the world are indistinguishable from her religious beliefs. Let's say that.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. That's helpful to hear. That helps me understand.
So, we've talked about this before. I don't know how much we want to get into this, but should we talk about some of the elements of this family, or should we just leave it at?
No, I think for that, we turn people to our original podcast.
Okay.
Unless there's anything you need to mention right now to briefly get into the next topic, but we have a whole episode on that. That's an hour long on Beyond the Veil. I think we're tempted to repeat a lot because it's been 2 years, but we do hope, John and I do hope, that everyone does go back and revisit our podcast, even if you've already heard it, or listen to it for the first time. It's the Beyond the Veil series. I'll have you can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, but you can also find it in the description of this video. And I hope that people that are watching the premiere will post a link to our Beyond the Veil playlist in chat as well. So just want to let everyone know that is a place. If there's anything you need to mention about those elements, great. But we also have a lot to cover. So.
Right. So, yeah. So I think if people if they want to know a little bit more about the dynamics of the Cox family, I would refer them to one of our previous podcasts. I don't remember the number. Would you happen to remember the?
Yeah. While you keep going, I'll look it up right now and let you know.
Okay. So this is going to be another important component of Breaking Bad, which is potential abuse. So it's really a gray area for us about whether Lori Vallow, in this case, because again, we're talking pre-Chad Daybell, experienced any type of abuse. So we know, and again, I would refer people back to our previous episode, but we know that there were some really poor sexual boundaries in this family. We know that Barry assaulted Steve Cope in front of Steve Cope's
Co-worker.
executive assistant.
Steve Cope was married to Stacy Cox. She was the oldest of the Cox children. She passed away from diabetes, is allegedly, but we've speculated on some other issues we believe there were. But that's who Steve Cope is. This was during their divorce or custody battle with Melanie Boudreau, their child.
Well, there's actually, so we've covered some of this in the previous podcast, but I'm gonna reiterate it because I'm talking about risk factors for abuse. So this is from a police report dated August 8th, 1995. This police report was filed by Steve Cope. He says, Barry Cox visited my place of employment. He wanted to discuss the divorce proceedings between his daughter Stacy and myself. He began quoting me scripture and questioning my integrity. It seemed odd to me, since he was recently charged for solicitation of prostitution. His voice got louder, at which time I stood up and asked him to lower his voice or leave. In front of, I won't mention the name, but in front of his executive assistant, he continued to verbally attack me. Barry then, the writing here is a little, Barry then, Barry then claimed to show me divorce papers by ripping my shirt open and ramming 50 pages or more into my shirt. He then grabbed my shirt with his fists and shoved me against the wall. He had his fists in my shirt around my neck. My executive assistant called 911. He then left and was cited for assault and domestic violence.
So this is Barry Cox, Lori Vallow Daybell's father.
Father, right. So
yeah. And before you continue, we're going to talk about what you just read. But our podcast episode is episode 7, Beyond the Veil, from August 2020, The Making of Lori Vallow Daybell. I'd recommend that one. Followed by episode 8, Beyond the Veil, The Many Extremes of Lori Vallow Daybell, part 1. Go ahead. Let's talk about Steve Cope's experience.
Yeah. So first of all, let me acknowledge this was a while ago, but obviously this is during a period of time when Lori was in the family, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So she was a child still, and I don't know the disposition of this particular situation. In other words, I don't know the outcome. I don't know what happened to Barry. I don't know whether this was reduced as a charge, whether he was convicted of assault, but the point is that you have some violence here in public, in the open. It's done in front of another person. He grabbed his throat. He pushed him up against the wall. He ripped his shirt. This is the sort of behavior that certainly would suggest that there could be some type of abuse or physical violence in the home. So
in Lori's family of origin, with her parents and siblings. Yeah.
Do I know that for sure? No, I don't. But this is not a normal way. Again, this is not a normal way to handle conflict. So Steve Cope is engaged in a custody dispute. Barry Cox is upset. This is the way he handles it. He goes to his work and threatens him. This is not, again, like Lori, resorting to kind of this binary type thinking. This is a very simplistic way of trying to solve problems. So we're seeing a similar type approach to decision making by the father. We're seeing some violence in the family, not directly, not specifically directed against the kids that we know of. But my point is that this type of violence would be a risk factor for family violence as well. So we have that. We know that Lori has claimed that she was physically abused and she was in domestic violence relationships in several of her marriages. Right. And so presumably, I guess we don't need to say exactly what marriages, but at least in several of her marriages, she's claiming that there was violence. So,
yes.
So we have several instances here of some type of abuse. This is in the Daybell text, what I call the text love letters. Chad Daybell says, this is when Chad was giving Lori a blessing. So Chad refers to himself as James. He refers to Lori as Elena in many of these texts.
Yeah, these texts also, if it were a book, it would be titled Loin Fire by Chad Daybell. So that's what you're reading from. And we did do a reading of this on our Patreon account as well.
So Chad is talking to Lori here, writing to Lori. He says, as they stayed in that favorite position, he moved his hands to her head and began to cleanse and purify each part of her body. This is the important part. Quote, he could feel the pains and troubles she had endured throughout her life being removed from her soul and being taken outside and destroyed. So there's some implication there by Chad that the pains and troubles she had endured throughout her life, there's some clear reference, some allusion there to abuse.
Agreed.
He's not telling us specifically what it is. We don't know if this is abuse in the family or domestic violence, but in any case,
that's what I thought when I read it for the first time too. Where is he going with that? What has Lori told him?
Right.
Yeah,
Chad is making a clear reference here, I think, to abuse. So,
and he's clearly manipulating the situation too. I want to point that out. That's what we discussed in our Patreon episode discussing this. Like but he knows something about trauma she's experienced, and he's using that in this moment to say that he's washing it all away and that he understands.
So this is going to take me back to the Breaking Bad article I referenced earlier. So again, it appears that there are some risk factors for some types of abuse in the Cox family. At the very least, I think we can say that Lori, from a fairly young age, when she was married was she married as a teenager? I think she was, right?
The first marriage to Nelson, they were boyfriend and girlfriend in high school, and I believe she was still a teenager when they got married, perhaps 18, but yes.
Okay, teenager. So, but the point is that whether it's abuse in the family of origin or domestic violence in some of her early relationships, there's abuse going on here. So I'm going to go back to Breaking Bad and the Rhetoric of Evil. This is page 94, Ronald Nasso. He's referring to a book by a psychoanalyst. Her name is Sue Grant. Sue Grant wrote a really beautifully written book called The Reproduction of Evil. It's fairly complex. Her arguments are fairly complex. So I'm going to go to Nasso's summary of Grant. Here he says, the book Reproduction of Evil was written in 2000. Here's what Nasso says about Grant's book. Quote, Sue Grant focuses special attention on the impact of early horrific trauma and the histories of individuals who have broken bad. Inspiring shame and dissociative efforts to preserve sanity, its legacy is a kind of psychic death, leaving some victims unable to connect emotionally with others except through the imposition of suffering. The need to reverse early experiences of helplessness and victimization can unleash horrendous destructiveness. So I love that quote, by the way. Sue Grant develops that idea in more depth than Nasso, but I love that quote because this whole notion of psychic death is also related to the idea of an empty self. Psychic death implies that the self is largely lost, the self is dead. And in order to bring that self back to life, you fill that hole or that void with abstractions or maybe ideology, whatever. You're going to fill it with something, I think, to try to feel alive. And so I think this is a really powerful idea that perhaps Lori Vallow, pre-Chad Daybell, experiences some type of abuse. Certainly Chad alludes to that. And that creates
Go ahead.
That creates this type of psychic death, which then, and helplessness, which then leads to behaviors, acting out type of behaviors to inflict harm, to feel more alive.
Wow. Yes. Thank you. I'm glad I waited. I want to say something else about her first marriage. I don't know what happened in her first marriage. I don't think John does either, but one thing we have heard from a very reliable source, and first off, her first marriage was very short-lived. It was very quick. She was very young. This was a high school, someone she dated in high school, but allegedly, according to this reliable source, she was kidnapped from this first marriage and taken back to her family of origin.
Right. So again, it's hard to know what these traumatic experiences are, what the exact abuse is, but we know that there's either descriptions or actual instances of abuse in her background. And so again, I think this idea of a false self or a psychic death, I think these things are all related. So you have this type of psychic death, which leads to these feelings of helplessness, and then you probably get some type of attempt to remedy those feelings of helplessness through certain behaviors, and we'll get to that in a second. So this leads us to our next question about Lori, and that is a question about personality disorders. So oftentimes in these types of situations, there's actually some fairly recent research showing that there's a possible correlation between childhood trauma and abuse and later borderline personality disorder. So, but I'm going to read, let's put that thought aside. I'm going to read from a book. This is a classic book about the impact of narcissism on children. So the Pressman book is about a family, the family system of narcissism. This book is more specifically about adults that have been in narcissistic families. It's by Ilan Golom. It was published, I believe, in the 90s as well, 1992. This is page 32. Golom says, and I quote, "The narcissistic parent lives on within the mind of the adult, even in the absence of the real parent. A final and tragic irony is that the child of a narcissist may herself have acquired many narcissistic traits up to and including being a full-blooded narcissist. Some common features might include self-centeredness, the compulsive need to be right and to have other people submit to her views, an inability to take criticism, the desire for perfection in self and or others she is close to, hypersensitivity combined with the continuous feeling of being mistreated, an exaggerated need for acclaim and support, and an even more desperate need for reassurance that she is loved." So I think that quote is the flip side of the narcissistic family, which is that if you have a self by proxy, it's not unreasonable that the person raised in a narcissistic family then can become a narcissist, or at least show some features of narcissism or other personality disorders. So on that front, we have, for example, this is an evaluation performed by Vivian Lewis.
The Vivian actually did not perform. Oh, the evaluation done by Vivian. You're reading from that, but she is not the one who interviewed Lori in what you're about to say.
I thought she did the interview. This is
nope,
not.
She did not. No, it makes it seem like that, but when you read the fine print, you realize she's using somebody else's interview to assess something. This is Vivian's evaluation, but she did not do the interview.
It's actually an interview. It's actually an evaluation on Joe Ryan, but in her diagnostic formulation, she does render an opinion about the biological mother, who is Lori.
Right.
And so it wasn't clear, but I thought she did an interview with Lori. It didn't look like it was a long interview, but I thought she did a collateral interview with Lori. That was my impression.
Yeah, this interview is part of her evaluation. She used this interview for her assessment, but it was done by someone else.
Okay. She says, based on the information she has, she says that there should be a rule out of histrionic and or borderline issues. So in other words, she's not definitively saying that Lori would receive a diagnosis of histrionic or borderline personality disorder, but she's saying that she thinks it's relevant and it could be an issue. So again, does Lori have a personality disorder? I don't know for sure, but it's interesting information that Vivian Lewis sees it as something that could be germane to this particular case. So
Right.
it's more information.
Correct. Right. We needing to rule out histrionic or borderline personality disorder, according to Vivian.
Right, exactly. So again, it's not diagnosing her, but
Right.
it's raising the question. And if you take the idea that there's oftentimes some correlation between childhood trauma and later personality disorders, then that would be perhaps, if there is abuse, that would be perhaps more information that would be relevant to Lori maybe having a personality disorder.
Correct. Right. And yeah. And were these ever ruled out? We don't know. We don't know.
Yeah. And so as long as we're and the question then is, people are probably saying, how is this relevant to Breaking Bad? Well, it's relevant to Breaking Bad because if somebody has a personality disorder, let's say Walter White has a personality disorder. Let's say Walter White, is deemed as a psychopath. Let's say he's stealing chemistry equipment from the lab. Let's say he's stealing money. He's embezzling money from the school. Let's say that he gets caught doing that and charged with some crimes, fraud, whatever. And let's say he gets evaluated by a psychologist, and the psychologist said, Walter White is a psychopath. That's so clear. Then you're going to have to reevaluate Walter's Breaking Bad, because you're going to have to say, well, the psychologist said that when he was a chemistry teacher, he was already a psychopath. So it wasn't cancer that was the trigger for his Breaking Bad. It was the fact that this guy was a psychopath. He had a personality disorder. So actually, and I should clarify that, I guess technically the diagnosis would be antisocial personality disorder, not psychopathy. Psychopathy is not technically a diagnosis in the DSM-5. So we would say that if a psychologist said that Walter White had antisocial personality disorder, then the argument becomes Walter White was already bad. He didn't break bad. He was a psychopath. He just did what he already was kind of predisposed to do. He started cooking meth. He was already a psychopath. He just upped his game. He became a bigger psychopath. So it's completely relevant here, because if Lori has some features of personality disorders prior to meeting Chad, then I think you have to say something similar. Given the analogy I just made with Walter White, something similar with her, which is that perhaps there were some inclinations to be bad, or to at least have some issues, some more ingrained or deeper issues prior to meeting Chad.
Yeah.
And so I want to start thinking about some of those. In one of our earlier podcasts, I speculated that perhaps she had some psychopathic features. I may have jumped the gun a little bit on that. I think I was getting a little exuberant in the moment. I don't know for sure if Lori would be a psychopath. I do want to say that I think she has some features of psychopathy. I don't know if she would qualify for the diagnosis, but
well, and being a psychopath isn't part of the DSM, so it's technically
but right. So
yeah.
So I want to talk about one of the more recent models of psychopathy. I've talked a lot about Robert Hare and his views on psychopathy and Hare's checklist and how that's sort of the gold standard. But there's a more recent model of psychopathy called the triarchic model of psychopathy. And this was developed by Christopher Patrick in 2009. He wrote what is by now a very well-known article in academic circles. It's called the triarchic conceptualization of psychopathy. And Patrick argues that it's triarchic. That means three. So he argues that there's really three components of psychopathy. Those three main components are meanness, disinhibition, which would be impulsiveness, and fearlessness, or he calls it fearless dominance, or sometimes boldness. Fearlessness and boldness would be similar. I'm going to read. So for our purposes, we talked about in one of our previous podcasts, Lori's propensity towards fearless dominance. She does tend to be fairly bold and fearless in many things, in many of her decisions. We've talked about her being impulsive, but for our purposes today, I want to focus on the meanness one. So
Okay.
meanness in the psychopathy literature, meanness is often also called callousness or it's often
Callousness, indifference too.
no, it's sometimes referred to as CU, which is callousness, unemotionality, unemotional.
Oh, interesting.
And so this trait, by the way, this meanness trait is oftentimes, according to the current research we know on psychopathy, the biggest predictor in children of later adult psychopathy. So children that have this callous, unemotional trait, otherwise called meanness, are at much higher risk to become psychopaths as adults. So I think this is really a critical variable in thinking about psychopathy. I'm going to read, this is page 927. This is from the Patrick article, his original article on the triarchic model, which, by the way, has received a lot of research support over the last decade. Here's how he defines meanness. The term mean describes a constellation of phenotypic attributes, including deficient empathy, disdain for and lack of close attachments with others, rebelliousness, excitement seeking, exploitativeness, and empowerment through cruelty. So I want us to keep in mind this last part here, empowerment through cruelty. That's going to be an important component of our discussion coming up here.
Okay, empowerment through cruelty.
Right. So why don't you, if you could, please go ahead and play. So I think we're going to introduce some information here that's not widely known, but if you could play the first segment on.
Do you want the interview of Lori's friends?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, people that have heard these interviews know this.
Okay, right.
But,
This one.
but those that are new to the case might not know this. So these are police interviews. We receive these actually in our FOIA requests. Once again, John and I like to find out what's hidden, and so we file FOIA requests, and we have these from law enforcement in Arizona. So 2 friends of Lori's are interviewed here with a similar story. Can I share them both, John? Just the whole thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Please put yourself on mute.
Oh.
Anything else that you could think of that's important, I guess, now knowing that we have all these criminal investigations going, that you overheard then, that, like I said, you might have written it off, but you go, oh man, now that all this is happening that's weird or bizarre? Or
in June, when we saw her after she'd been gone a couple of months, when I say we, Christine and I got together with her, she had said that, and Christine would be able to recall, I don't even take ibuprofen, so I have no understanding of medicine or anything of that nature.
Okay.
But there was some sort of, I think it was a medicine of some sort, and I don't know if it was something Charles took or if it's something that maybe was another medication that JJ took.
Okay.
I know JJ took quite a bit of medicine.
Yeah.
It's different issues, but she had said that she had been putting whatever this was into, I think, a smoothie or some sort of drink for Charles when she was in Texas.
Okay.
It was last month.
What's going on?
The day that I was telling you about the last time I seen Lori, that I went out to visit with her, it wasn't just about her brother. I remember that she'd made a comment about crushing up some of her son's, what's it called? It sounded like Give me 1 second. My brain. It's for Xanax.
Xanax
is what it was.
Okay. Yeah, you know what? Oh, dear. Who? Sorry about that. Who told me that? I can't remember if it was. I think it was Nicole.
You think Melanie?
Yeah, no, Nicole said, hey, yeah, because she said, I was there. She said, Christina and I were there. So she'd said,
Okay.
And that was, she couldn't remember the medication, but she said that she told both of you guys. And that was when they were back in Texas, right?
Yes. So
Okay.
when I went back over, I just said, look, I don't know what's going on with you, but anyway, my one thing was the way that her brother had talked, but realizing also she'd made a comment about putting some Xanax in his drink mix, like his protein milk shake or something that he was taking.
Okay.
And so I said, Lori, are you serious? Did you actually do that? She's like, well, I could only put maybe 1 or 2 in because it's obvious, but he's so hyper and so on top of me. And she's like, I was just being a smart aleck, and it's really not a big deal, and he takes it all the time anyway. And
Gotcha.
kind of thing.
Okay.
So I don't know, because she kind of backpedaled on it, if he really did take it too. I don't know, but it sounded like both he and JJ took Xanax.
Okay. Good. That's perfect. I was trying to. I forgot to follow up with you on that.
Yeah. So that was all I could remember from that. Surprised I didn't that day, but
Not a problem.
I remembered a couple hours after you left.
Yeah, I just happened upon your doorstep, and it was random and out of the blue, so not a problem, but I appreciate you calling and following up with me.
So, according to 2 friends, Nicole and Christina, Lori would drug Charles Vallow's smoothies with Xanax. Mute.
Yeah. And so the reason we're starting with this particular example is because it's proof. This is definitive proof. I know in the second interview, she said that Lori sort of backtracked on that, but
Yeah, Christina said, well, she was like, it's not a big deal, just 1 or 2.
right. But let's dig into this for a second. Like, it is a big deal. It is a big deal because Lori is introducing a controlled substance without consent and unknowingly into Charles' drinks. That, by any statute, is a crime. It's not only a crime, it's a felony. In most states, it's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So why is this important? Because 2 people are saying that she's doing this. Lori doesn't see it as a big deal because Lori wants to control his behavior. Whatever her justification is, it doesn't matter. This is criminal behavior. She's introducing a controlled substance, let's call it poison, because Charles doesn't know he's taking these drinks. She's essentially poisoning Charles. She doesn't see it as a big deal because apparently she sees it as helping him, but I'm sure Charles would like to know that he's being poisoned.
Not only does she not seem to think it's a big deal, she thinks it's fun to tell her friends about it. Like that, she almost like she's proud of it, right? It's just
right. And so here we have this idea of empowerment through cruelty. This is where we're getting it, right? Because she feels empowered, she's controlling his behavior, and although this particular case isn't as clear-cut as the next one we're going to talk about, she potentially has his life in her hands. She could easily create a situation where he overdoses. She could easily create a situation where she essentially murders him, whether knowingly or not. And so I don't see any other way of saying that that's cruel. When you poison people, there's a sadistic component in the sense that you're negatively affecting someone's behavior and emotional state and mental state deliberately through a controlled substance. And so I think this is a great instance of this trait of meanness that we're gonna start to explore here. If you could please play the Larry Woodcock piece. So we're gonna take this idea and we're gonna run a little bit further with it. We're gonna deepen this idea here.
So yes, let me introduce what we're about to listen to too, because this is some never heard. This is a never heard before story told by Larry Woodcock when he was at our house 2 years ago this month, April, 2 years ago this month. We have not shared this until this moment. So let's take a listen to what Larry Woodcock has to say.
I'm going to give y'all a little bit of insight that is absolutely not known to anybody. 2 people know it. One of the last times we went to Hawaii, and the day we left, Lori had fixed a fruit salad. I love fruit salads.
He loved her fruit salad.
I loved her fruit salad, and she knew it because I told her. I said, "You just absolutely make one of the best fruit salads I've ever had." And when Kay just said what she said, I was immediately drawn to the statement I'm fixing to make. When we left Hawaii that morning or that evening, we boarded the plane. Plane took off, and about halfway through the trip, I woke up and I told Kay I'm dying. Now, I've had enough people die in front of me, die in my arms, around me that's died. I know in general the symptoms of that. And I truly believed in my heart that I was dying. I was going to die there on that plane. Well, Kay kept telling, the stewardess and everybody, we got to do something. I said, no, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. We made the trip into Vegas. As we were walking down the corridor to get our luggage and the people mover on the escalator, I just got so sick. And I honestly, in my heart, I thought I was going to die right there. And then I started throwing up. Kay had bought
I had a brand new
Saints
cap, a ball cap that I had worn one time, and it was in my bag. And here we are on a people mover. And so Larry said, I'm going to throw up. And I said, well, he said, give me something to throw up in. And I just opened my bag, and he grabbed that hat out of it, and he threw up in my new Saints hat.
And I filled it up.
And then when we got off the people mover, then we just threw it away. But anyway.
But I'm wondering, and I've wondered this since it happened to us, because you and I talked about it. And I even asked Kay one time, I said, do you think she was trying to kill me? And Kay naturally said, no, I don't. I mean, for what reason? But why would she want to kill me? And I've always, in my heart, since that time, since the day we were on that escalator, and as I said, Kay and I talked about this, I just wondered if maybe in hindsight, and my point in saying what I just said, my point is, I tried to figure, well, what would she gain out of it by doing something with me, if that was her attempt? What would she gain out of it? But she and Kay were so close. One of the things that I've always tried to do is figure what angle would she use, where would she go with that? Why me? I mean, as far as I knew, she thought that I was, her bestie, and from everything Kay has told me, that that Lori has told her that, she
the
thought I
sun
was
rose and set and rose on Larry every day.
Yeah.
I mean, she just thought
And-
that much of him.
I think, first of all, thanks for sharing that story. It is remarkable. And I'm probably never going to forget the Saints hat as long as I live. Did you get the hat replaced? Or did you throw it out? You did. You got. Did you, Brian? No. Okay. I was gonna say, yeah. I think that hat wasn't salvageable.
It was not salvageable. I loaded that hat down, and it was fruits and. But I can tell you, I've never been poisoned, and so I can't. I don't have any personal experience, but in looking at in retrospective everything that has happened, maybe she in her mind, maybe she did have come up with a reason to, but I can't imagine what it would be.
So I think. If I were to offer a professional perspective on that, I think you don't need reasons if that's true, if she was trying to kill you. In other words, she's not sitting down and saying, she doesn't have a pro and con list when she's poisoning your food. She's just thinking, Larry looked at me funny this morning. I am so angry at him, or I'm tired of him, or maybe she took something you said as a criticism or a slight. Like it doesn't have to be as it can be as simple as that. Like there's no, I know it's for normal, rational human beings, we want reasons. We want to say she's killing me for money. But with somebody like Lori, there's no reasons. It could have been something that you just had no clue about.
Well, look, and thinking back through all of this, I think one of the things that I never put up with Lori's bullshit.
That would be a reason.
And now I respected her because she had JJ, but all this trying to convince our granddaughter that she needed to be part of this cult and wanted her to start reading books that Chad wrote.
She did.
Yes.
So and maybe
Okay.
Maybe for some reason, because I didn't go along with her beliefs, and I never hid that from her, because I think she totally understood that her BS was not going to work with me, and I would call her out onto it, but I think maybe that's part of it. I don't know. I've tried, like you said, those type of people don't need a reason. Up until just a few minutes ago, there's only two people that knew about this, Kay and myself. And I will, without a doubt, still in my heart believe that there was something trying to be committed, because I've been sick. I know what it is to be sick. I know
Right.
what it is to be afraid. And I can tell you, I was praying that I didn't want to die on an airplane.
Unmute. So there you go. First time hearing this story that John and I heard 2 years ago. And it hasn't left our mind since.
Right. And so here we are, we're asking this question about whether Lori broke bad or not. And this is way before Chad Daybell, this story. So here we have another instance of potential poisoning. Do we know for sure that that's what Lori was
No.
trying to do here? We don't, because it was fruit. And of course, we all know that fruit can go bad and it can create problems. But Larry seemed pretty convinced that this was way beyond fruit, that this had to do with poisoning. He would have had no reason, by the way, to go to the hospital, or he couldn't go to the hospital. He was on a plane, but
Yeah, he was on an airplane.
he had no motivation to get blood work done to see if this was poisoning, because
It didn't occur to him then.
Right.
Yeah,
at that point, he trusted Lori. But looking back, now that we know what he did to Charles, that she clearly poisoned his drinks, his smoothies, it seems to me like this is a pattern that we're starting to see. That this story, if this was a poisoning attempt, again, we can't prove it, but let's say that it was. This gets into that quality of meanness. This gets into that callous, unemotional trait of empowerment through cruelty. I love that term because I think that really captures it. This is about Lori feeling empowered. If we talk about,
that would be a reason. In other words, that would be a reason.
A motive, right? If we talk about this idea of psychic death or the empty self or a false self, then this is an attempt to transform that sense of victimization and helplessness through poisoning to feel more empowered. And that's what she's doing. So, and again, this type of behavior, this type of meanness, if this is one of the main components of psychopathy, again, we have to question. I'm not saying Lori's a psychopath, but does she have some of these elements or these traits of psychopathy? I don't know. It seems like she might here. So again, if that's accurate, then clearly this is someone who didn't break bad with Chad. Clearly this is someone who was struggling with these types of issues, with this type of badness prior to Chad, well prior to Chad.
Right.
Let's just finish up this. So there's another video that maybe you could play, and I don't want to spend a lot more time on this because we have a lot to cover still, but.
Hey, well, so this is about Tylee. This is Nancy Grace. I'll put the link to this video in the description as well if anyone wants to go see this. So this is Nancy Grace interviewing Lori's friend from Hawaii, April Raymond, and they're discussing Tylee. Here we go. Okay.
Had a lot of health issues, and they could never really get to the bottom of them.
What kind of health problems that the doctors couldn't figure out?
Tylee was always sick, and she would be in her room resting or sleeping or recovering or just getting back from the doctor. When she was younger, they told me that she had had several surgeries to try to figure out what was wrong and to try to fix things, and it never accomplished anything.
Was Lori Vallow primarily involved in Tylee's treatments?
Yes.
If a fleet of doctors in a metropolitan city can't figure out what's wrong, and cult mom Lori Vallow was the primary person taking care of her, I'd be very, very curious to find the true nature of Tylee Ryan's ailments, and if they were somehow inflicted on her. And would Lori Vallow be there alone with her at the time she began manifesting the pain, and when the pain would go away? And what, if any, attention would Lori Vallow receive when Tylee would be ill? This is the first time hearing of this, and I'm very, very distressed.
Okay.
There you go.
So here we have.
Let me just say this too. While we're hearing this from between April and Nancy Grace, we have heard from several people about Tylee always being sick and in the hospital. We've seen photos of her in the hospital. This is most of you that follow this case know this is a very repeated story. So go ahead.
Right, exactly. And there's diagnoses, there are multiple diagnoses of pancreatitis, which it seems in these diagnoses to have no clear cause. So the question here becomes, and this is from, by the way, this is from a Guardian ad litem report to the court, July 15th, 2009. I'm just going to quote this. In the same period of time, Tylee was age 6. She was diagnosed with pancreatitis, having had 2 episodes requiring hospitalization between February of 2006 and 2008. So there's clear documentation of pancreatitis and many other ailments, back pains that are inexplicable, that have no clear cause. This raises the question of whether this is some version of factitious disorder imposed on another, otherwise previously known as Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. I think that's the issue that April and Nancy Grace are raising here too, right? They're questioning whether Lori is poisoning or introducing a substance into Tylee's drinks or food, and is that responsible for all her physical ailments? My short answer to that is we don't know for sure, but again, we're looking at, here we go. Larry Woodcock almost dies from what he believes is poisoning. We know for sure that she's introducing controlled substances into Charles' drinks. We have inexplicable reasons for Tylee's illnesses, right? You have all of these elements are coming together.
And let me add one more, a testimony of JJ's last babysitter in Rexburg, who she said that Lori told her that she could give JJ Benadryl to help him sleep.
Yeah, and this is from an affidavit written by filed in the courts by Cheryl Wheeler. I'm just going to do a quick quote on this. There's a couple things in this affidavit I want to point out. One is a quote from one of her sons. I'm not going to mention the name of her son because Cheryl has gone to great lengths to try to protect the identity and privacy of her kids. But here's a quote from one of Cheryl's kids. He was, I believe, around 12 years old at the time. He says, quote, Lori gave us all kinds of those green Advil / NyQuil and Lunesta pills so we could go to bed early. They practically shoved it down our throat. Also in that affidavit, she talks about that there is a diagnosis in one of the health reports of one of the Vallow children. I'm not going to mention name again here, but there's an actual diagnosis in a chart pertaining to this particular situation that Cheryl says, the quote, the quoting states that the application indicates Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. So a doctor that they dealt with to deal with a lot of medical problems back then that was treating one of the children. Again, I'm not going to say who the child is, but one of the children.
And this was a skin rash, by the way, a skin rash.
Yeah, skin rash. One of the children in the household was having some problems, and the child gets diagnosed because the causes are so vague and so nebulous, gets diagnosed with Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. Now we call it factitious disorder imposed on another, so there is actual evidence in a medical chart, I believe today as we speak, of a diagnosis pertaining to Lori of Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. So
can I say something about this really quickly too? Because I reached out to Cheryl.
Yep.
Many people have seen this affidavit. It's floated around the web. It refers to Lori and Charles, concerns Cheryl had, but so I reached out to her for clarification, and she stated this, and I just want to say this too, because I asked her, I was like, "Is this Lori and Charles? Help me out here. Like what, you know?" She said, "I believe this was only Lori." This is from Cheryl Wheeler to us, and she said that I could share this. I believe it was only Lori. Charles just didn't think like this. During our marriage, I was the primary caretaker. I am not complaining about that. But Charles would have naturally defaulted to Lori's style of mothering, and then add that, and then she some personal stuff that I won't share, and then she said that I know that you understand the affidavit was during a custody battle. This custody battle would not have even been brought up if it were not for Lori's involvement in my children's life. So the custody battle was only happening because Lori entered her children's life, according to Cheryl Wheeler. So I want to share that too. Go ahead, John.
Right. That all of these, again, so the main point is that all of these physical ailments and health problems started when Lori enters the picture.
Right.
Charles may have been involved in some of that indirectly, but it's not, but the cause is Lori, that Lori is the driver and the impetus for all these physical ailments. Prior to Lori, there were no issues with the kids at all with Charles.
Right.
So I think it's
important to note.
Right. That's the important point. I'm going to read a quote here. This is from a book on Munchausen's. This is, by the way, a really fascinating book on Munchausen's. There's not a lot of great books written about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but this is called Hurting for Love, Munchausen's by Proxy Syndrome. It's by Schreier and Lebeau. It was also, I believe, written in the 90s. Let me give you the exact date here, 1993. Here's what they say about Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. This is page 95. They, meaning mothers, often mothers, they seize the opportunity afforded by the birth of a child to actively relate to and control physicians by amplifying a minor ailment in their children or inducing an illness in their infants. In so doing, they try to maintain an intense yet distant, perverse, and ambivalent relationship with a powerfully loved and powerfully feared paternal representative. As we will demonstrate, the physician comes to represent a second chance at a longed-for relationship with the father. But the fear of yet another abandonment is equally, if not more, powerful. What these case studies suggest is that the good Munchausen's by proxy syndrome mother is a masquerade of mothering that springs from childhood roots that were quietly traumatic, include a profound absence of recognition of the child who will become a Munchausen's by proxy syndrome mother. Many of these young girls, so she's referring to before their mothers.
Okay.
Many of these young girls feel neglected and desperate for approval and recognition. So their argument, the author's argument, is that Munchausen's is a function of, interestingly enough, the desire for paternal love. No doubt Lori had a lot of conflict with her father. And so it's interesting that there is that element, or at least in the case studies that they evaluate, they believe there's that element. And the main payoff is attention and recognition, but specifically the attention and recognition of the father. So I think you have, and also previous neglect, trauma, childhood trauma. So I think you have a lot of those elements in this particular case. The thing that I really started thinking about after reading that book, by the way, is this idea of triangulation. We talked about this with Murdoch, how I've talked about the family therapist Murray Bowen, who says that the basic unit in a family is a triangle. So when there's problems between two members in a family, often the third member will be brought in to diffuse the conflict, to take the heat down. And with Tylee, I think Tylee plays that role to a very large extent in this family that Tylee's always brought in to diffuse conflicts between other people. That Tylee becomes this pawn of sorts. And I mean, it's sad. It's sad, but I think there's this attempt by Lori to triangulate Tylee, who she's very conflicted about, by the way. Lori detests Joe Ryan. And unfortunately, Tylee is the daughter of Joe Ryan. So I think in some ways, Tylee suffers by association with Joe Ryan. I think Lori has this constant approach avoidance relationship with Tylee in the sense that she wants to be close to her, but then she gets angry at her because she associates her with Joe Ryan. So I think that if there is Munchausen's in this particular case, or factitious disorder, it has something to do with that dynamic, that she feels a great deal of love and dependency towards Tylee, but she also wants to punish her because of her association with Joe Ryan. So I think the poisoning is an attempt to keep Tylee close because she's sick all the time and Tylee needs her. There's a dependency, but it's also an attempt to inflict harm on Tylee because she represents that association to Joe Ryan. So it's sort of this, I love you, but I'm going to punish you type relationship. And it's also, I think, applicable to her hospital stays. That I think there's this interesting dynamic that this book points out, that the physician gets triangulated.
Mhm.
You know, I'd be really curious to know if there's a consistent physician who's treating Tylee that Lori is interested in or attracted to, right? That would make this even more fascinating, because now Lori is showing up with a physician who she can't really have a relationship with. She's married, but yet there's this fantasy of paternal love, that she gets to go to this physician, and it's sort of risk-free in the sense that she's around this physician all the time. I presume it would be a male in that case. She gets to be seen as this really good mother because she's always bringing her daughter in for attention. And yet, at the same time, she's inflicting suffering and pain on her daughter by poisoning her. And nobody can figure out what's going on, really. I mean, pancreatitis might be a valid diagnosis, but that's questionable.
Or even, I mean, not just attention from a doctor, though, right? Attention from her family. Tylee's sick again. Tylee's in the hospital. Everyone knows. Lori's there, being a good mother. Charles is on his own, you know, taking care of JJ, or, you know, before or after Charles. You know, this, everybody knows where she is. People are coming to visit Tylee and Lori. She's getting that attention, that recognition.
Right. Yeah. And so the main motivations, I think, for Munchausen's would be attention and recognition, and the poisoning component of that would be empowerment. That Lori has this secret sense of empowerment, that she's in control, that she is punishing Tylee. And I'm not saying that's conscious, by the way. I think the way she's punishing Tylee here is she knows she's potentially, and again, I don't know for sure if this is true, but she knows potentially that she's harming her and punishing her through medication or poison, whatever she's giving her. But she also knows that she's going to get a positive payoff from that, as you said, from attention. But she's in control of the situation. This is her drama. She's in control from start to finish, and that's an important piece of this too, I think.
Right.
So I'm just going to read another. So we're still on this question of whether Lori broke bad or whether she was already bad prior to Chad Daybell. So hopefully we're getting closer to an answer with that. I think this is another letter to the courts from Mary Vogel. This is from February 28th, 2008.
And so people understand Mary Vogel was the ad litem. She took the place of Tom Ware. So Tom Ware, the ad litem of Tylee's, was released from the case, and Mary Vogel came in.
Here's what Mary says, February 28th, 2008. She's talking about the relationship, the custody battle for Tylee. She says this is a pattern that has continued to spiral Tylee's life into a dramatic and destructive situation that I do think is harmful and have outlined in previous letters and reports to the court. If these events and situations persist, I believe that it becomes more and more possible to overlook something truly dangerous or exaggerate something that is manipulative in nature. It is a dangerous pattern. So the Mary Fogel, the guardian ad litem to Tylee, is essentially telling the courts that she thinks that Lori Vallow at the time, that Lori Vallow is more than capable of creating harm to another human being. And that she actually sees her as dangerous. So
At one point, Mary suggested foster care for Tylee.
Yeah.
At one point during this custody battle, she brought up foster care and had researched it and was looking to see if Tylee might actually be safer in a foster care situation.
So let's go back to our question about what's the storyline, what's a potential storyline that someone could develop in the trial to get Lori Vallow Daybell acquitted. It seems to me that the most compelling storyline would be that Lori had a few mental health problems early on in her life, nothing too bad. She was the victim of some trauma in her family. She had some bad relationships that were violent, but she had no criminal record. She meets Chad Daybell. She breaks bad. Chad Daybell makes all the decisions. She's not involved in many of those decisions. Alex Cox may be communicating with Chad Daybell. Alex Cox is responsible for the murders. Lori's just this innocent victim who's caught up in the whirlwind, who breaks bad as a result of Chad. But here, I think we're presenting some evidence that maybe that narrative isn't accurate. Right? We're questioning whether Lori had a personality disorder prior to Chad. It seems like there's some evidence that she may have. The other thing we didn't mention is that that Alex Cox assaulted Joe Ryan previously and spent time in prison. That we have to assume that clearly that Lori would know about that assault. If not, if Lori not only probably knows about it, but she may very well have asked Alex to do that. And so in that particular instance, we're seeing the same pattern that we see with Daybell. Right? That Lori is requesting violence from her brother. Did she request that same type of violence? And did Chad and Lori both request that violence from Alex? Did Lori? I mean, we don't know for sure, but again, this would be evidence that she didn't break bad, that she was already involved in similar types of schemes and behaviors prior to Chad Daybell. And then, of course, there's this major issue about Lori potentially poisoning other people. We know for sure that she poisoned Charles. That seems indisputable. She may have poisoned Larry. We've heard other stories about other adults that probably experienced similar issues. There's a question here about factitious disorder imposed on another with Tylee, about her over-medicating other children that she was raising, right? There's clearly a big question here about the pattern.
Right.
And so let's go back to this issue of risk. And I want to talk a little bit about motive too. Why did Walter White break bad? If Lori breaks bad, and we assume it probably had to have been earlier in her life. So when Lori did break bad, if she did break bad, it would have occurred probably around the time that she decided that poisoning people was a valid strategy for coping with the world. I've already discussed how I think that Walter White would be a very low risk prior to getting cancer. I think that Lori Vallow Daybell, prior to meeting Chad Daybell, would have been a reasonably serious risk. And I'm not the only one, right? The Mary Fogel identifies her as a danger to Tylee. that if the Munchausen's is accurate, and if this poisoning other people is accurate, she's an immense risk.
Mhm.
All of that occurs before Chad. So the question here is, if Lori is capable of poisoning other human beings, which is an in Nevada, let's say that Charles dies from the Xanax, let's say he overdoses, that's actually that's attempted murder by poisoning. That's actually a felony that results in life in prison. So
Wow.
so is it possible to go from these types of behaviors to murdering kids? And the answer is it has to be, because of this cruelty or this meanness component, this trait that is often found in psychopaths, that if you're willing to inflict harm upon your spouse and your daughter, then, and which in many ways is objectifying them, it's dehumanizing them, it's seeing them as objects, then you're probably willing to take the next step and murder them at some point if the situation calls for it. So I have said in the past that I think Chad Daybell plays a major role in Lori's decisions. I do still think that. I think that Chad becomes the catalyst where murder becomes possible. I believe that if Chad doesn't come in the picture, the probability is less that these children are murdered. However, that propensity towards violence is already there. That dehumanization of her kids is already there. And so that leap to murder is not a major leap.
Can I bring up a thought about that, or do you need to keep going? I don't want to hurt your.
Yeah.
So we have an interview on our Beyond the Veil podcast with Dr. Christine that I'd recommend anyone to listen to. And Dr. Christine shares her own personal story. She was LDS, and a false prophet manipulated her severely. There was polygamy involved. There was scripture involved. And she was falling for all of it. And she was severely abused throughout this entire situation. And it got to a certain point where her abuser, the false prophet, said to her, I need you to give your kids up for adoption. I need you to get rid of your kids if we're going to continue, if you're going to be, by my side in all of this. And it was that moment that she thought, no way. No way. That was the beginning of her way out of the manipulation. It took a while. She hid her kids from him, but she didn't give them up for adoption. And I've always thought of that story as a great example of where you're going with this. Chad is the catalyst. Chad is the one making the request. This is Chad's belief system. Right. This is what he's asking of Lori. He's deeming Tylee dark, and JJ's now a zombie too. And now his own wife is a zombie, but if Lori had been a healthier person, like Dr. Christine had been, I think she would have thought, no way. And what is he asking of me? But she didn't. And I just want to point that out too. And that, for me, helps me to kind of explain their two separate roles in this.
Yeah. So I agree. Right. That Lori has already dehumanized her kids previously, especially Tylee, probably JJ to some degree, because she's medicating him to sleep. In fact, all the kids in the home. She's using medication and or poison to control them. And so there's already this dehumanization, which means that when she meets Chad and Chad refers them to the kids or to the people that are going to be murdered as zombies, that's not much of a leap. She's not going to object to that, whereas Dr. Christine did. So I do want to, we're getting a little stretched for time here. I do want to conclude with some final thoughts. what are the motives, right? Let's talk about Walter White for a second. For Walter White, the reason he cooks meth and breaks bad is because, at least initially, he says he's doing it for his family, and that makes sense. He doesn't want to leave his family in debt over his medical bills. He wants to provide. He has a son that's disabled. He wants to provide for him. He has a daughter that was recently born. So, but what is Lori up to? Let's go back to the infamous murder testimony for a minute.
Okay, this is the same event we started with. Lori stating she didn't have a murderous heart. She just wanted to stop the pain and the bleeding, and she started going to the temple every day. This is from that same moment, recorded that same time at Melanie Gibbs' home, 2008, October 2008.
I too, like Melanie, have had the love of Jesus Christ washed over me. There is nothing like that on this earth. It is life-changing and eternity-altering. I love my Savior with my whole heart. After I've had this washing over of the Lord, who gave me all of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world. I've spent so much time in dark courtrooms where the evil powers overpower those rooms. And I spent so much time in there that he washed all of that away from me.
Dr. John.
Yeah, so I think that is fascinating to me, because I think really getting close to something like true motive with that, in the sense that Lori's is basically telling us that she can't do real relationships. That she's more interested in this idea of eternal or celestial love. We know that she's obsessed with Twilight. Twilight is a relationship between a vampire and a human.
And it's immortal love, not of this
Right.
world.
It's not of this world, but it's a pure fantasy. And so I think what Lori never had was real human love. I think that there's a big gap there with her father, that there's a real hole in her heart, because her father, I think, was somewhat distant and maybe struggled to convey a sense of love to Lori, at least. I don't know about the other kids in the family, and again, you just heard the quote I read about how factitious disorder imposed on another, or Munchausen's. I prefer Munchausen's because it's a little more poetic, so I prefer the term Munchausen's, but how Munchausen's is in many ways an attempt to regain paternal love that never really was there. And so I think you have a version of that here. That, let me read from, this is from the Chad Daybell love text again. These are so critical to understanding this case, by the way.
Loin fired text. Yes.
Chad says he meaning Chad, he knew they had been eternal companions for eons, and that their love was beyond celestial. Right? What a statement. He's telling her not only have they been together for eternity and eons, but their love was beyond celestial. Celestial is heavenly love. But he's saying, so Chad is selling her, not only is Chad telling her she's a goddess, but he's essentially telling her that their love is beyond.
More specifically, I want to say in Mormon doctrine, celestials as high as you get. In Mormon doctrine, heaven has different degrees of glory, and celestial is as high as you go. So it's beyond celestial. Go ahead.
Right. And so this is, people have talked about how Chad isn't her type physically, and she's usually with these guys that are maybe more attractive and more physically imposing, but that's not really what Chad is appealing to. He's appealing to the very thing that Lori just said to us, that she wants a love that is beyond this world. In other words, she wants a love that doesn't exist. She wants a love that exists in fantasy. And so in the Netflix documentary and in talking to Colby personally, he mentioned a few times that his mother was often talking about the story of Abraham and Isaac. And in many ways, that story is, I think, relevant to this particular situation, because God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac because God is testing his commitment to celestial love. In other words, to God, to a love beyond the human plane. And Isaac is spared at the end. However, I think that Lori would feel that story, if it was necessary to sacrifice children, I think that Lori would feel compelled to do that, especially if Chad was asking her. I think Chad may very well have made that request because he was testing her love. He was testing her loyalty. And I think Lori would not have objected to that, because she would have seen this whole idea of eternal love and celestial love as being the most compelling thing that she could ever want. This is what she wanted more than anything else. And the reason she wanted that is because of all her childhood wounds and their traumas, potentially abuse, because of her strained relationship with her father, because of this notion of psychic death that I quoted about why people break bad, this sense of helplessness, and this really strong desire for attention and recognition. And ultimately, if she was poisoning people, to feel that sense of empowerment through poisoning and through cruelty. And so I think that when we dig deep enough, this is where we land. We land on this idea of love that is an illusion, love that exists in fantasy.
Yes.
I do want to, I'm going to end here with a few quotes. I want to go back to Walter White. This is
the Walter White sound that we're not allowed to use if anybody overseas wants to watch us.
This is from a book. It's called Philosophy and Breaking Bad. It's a brilliant, for those Breaking Bad fans that are willing to go the extra length to really think about Breaking Bad, this is a really excellent book. Philosophy and Breaking Bad. It's edited by Decker, Kopsel, and Arp. This is from that book. This is in the introduction. This particular article, I think, is written by, let me check here. It's written by, I don't know which author wrote the introduction, but page 19 and 20. The authors say, we are meant to disdain Walt and to cast judgment on his deeds and motivations. He is certainly no role model, but then few epic heroes are. But it is the journey that is important. Walt was a nobody who becomes a legend, his alter ego's name whispered in hushed tones, spray painted on walls, and in the real world, iconic and ubiquitous. There's little sense in distinguishing Walt from other heroes whose histories are spotted with violence and death. The world that he leaves behind is not worsened, and the lives of his children are improved by his actions. Numerous criminal drug lords are left dead in his wake, as well as a clutch of nasty white supremacists and a couple of crooked business people too. Perhaps Walt is not a hero as such, but his journey is undeniably the hero's journey, and his appeal to us is similarly undeniable. If he ended the show as merely evil, we would have lost interest and felt betrayed. We feel instead a sense of justice in the final act. I love that because there's certainly a complexity to Walter White in the sense that we could really have a strong argument about why he's, if and why he would be heroic. And I think the authors here begin answering that in many ways, Walt is on this hero's journey to figure out who he is. And while he creates this trail of destruction and death, oftentimes bad guys get killed, by the way, not good guys. In the end, I think, as the authors point out, maybe there's the sense of justice, that the bad guys got their due. And comparatively, I see that as a bit of a litmus test. Comparatively, there's no sense in which we could ever say that Lori Vallow Daybell leaves this story with a sense of justice.
Right.
There's no justice in Lori's story. There's no happy ending. There's no bad guys getting their due, right? And so that's a big difference between Breaking Bad and Lori. That Walt may break bad, but in that Breaking Bad, he really is trying to figure out who he is. He's really struggling, whether we agree with it or not, he's really struggling for authenticity. And towards the end, he says something to the effect of, Skylar, who is his wife, confronts him and says, you keep saying you're doing this for family, but I don't think you are. Tell me the truth. And Walt says something to the effect of, I'm doing it for myself. And what Walt means is that he wants to figure out who he is. He doesn't want to be that meek loser at the beginning that everyone's mocking. He wants to feel powerful. He wants to feel like he's made a difference. I don't know that he would have knowingly chosen to cook meth and become a drug lord. But in some ways, as the authors say here, the world is potentially a better place and maybe there's some sense of justice. But in no way can we feel that the Daybell story has that sense of justice. And in no way has Lori made any type of authentic journey or hero's journey to figure out who she is. So I think that contrast really kind of, when I read that, by the way, I thought about how vastly different these two stories are. Yeah. And how, although, I don't know, I would see Walt White as a hero. I think that the difference is that Chad and Lori Daybell leave nothing but harm and suffering and pain in their wake. Whereas at least Walter White struggled to figure out who he was and what he was capable of. And he did leave, he did potentially leave the world a better place, and he left the world a more just place. And I wish we could say the same about Daybell.
Thank you. And for the kids at home, Walter White is not a reason to break bad.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't believe a lot of kids are going to listen to this, but for the adults at home, please don't break bad and cook meth and become drug lord, because Walter White is still fictional. And although we kind of root for him, he's not necessarily the best guy on the planet either. But I do agree with that assessment that he did get rid of a lot of bad guys and he really did love his family, and maybe he did leave the world a little better.
We can learn so many lessons from this story. Don't fall for false prophets. Don't date Katy Perry, for those that have watched our older podcast, our older episodes, and stay out of portals.
And don't break bad either. Try not to, don't break. The best way to avoid any of this is not to break bad.
Yes. It is so sad. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. Even if we're not here with you live in the moment, we are here. We are watching with you, and we've appreciated this chat and the conversation that it's creating. Thank you, everyone, again, for your kind thoughts with my brother. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful March book club meeting we had this week. Dr. John, people are wanting to know April's book, so you're going to have to announce it soon.
Yeah.
And
I'm working on it.
And we now have that video of our book club, March book club, up on patreon.com. / hidden true crime. Thank you to everyone. And thank you for your support while we are in Boise covering this trial. We're going to take each day at a time. We're going to learn a lot. You know, we'll find out if we get into court every day. We'll find out. We'll find out a lot, and we'll bring you all the latest. So, thank you for your patience and your kindness and sticking with us throughout this whole journey. And may there be some sense of justice in the end, for the Woodcocks and the many victims of Chad and Lori Daybell. Thanks, everyone, and have a good night.
All right. Good night. Thanks, guys.